12 interpreters, the best in the country. Flown in, briefed, paid well, and every single one of them failed. The negotiation was worth $300 million. 3 nations at one table each side, with something to lose. But somewhere between the languages, the meaning kept slipping. Wrong, words wrong, tone, wrong, silence. And by midnight, the whole deal was 40 seconds from collapse. That was when a janitor mopping the hallway floor outside pushed open the door and spoke. Fluent, precise, in 4 languages without hesitation. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone in that room had the same thought. Who is this man, and why can he do what none of us could? The 42nd floor of the Harrington Financial Tower did not look like a place where things went wrong. Everything up there was deliberate. The long glass conference table, the leather chairs, the city of Chicago spread out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, like something designed to remind you how high you'd climbed. At 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the building's lower floors were empty and dark. But on 42, every light was on. Daniel Brooks was not supposed to be part of any of it. He was in the hallway 40 feet from the conference room door, pushing a mop across marble floors that no one would notice until they were dirty again. He wore a gray uniform with the building logo on the chest. He had a badge clipped to his pocket and a pair of earbuds around his neck that he hadn't used all night. He moved slowly, methodically, the way a man moves when he has learned not to waste energy on things that don't matter. He was 38 years old. He had been doing this job for 3 years. He had a son named Noah, 8 years old, asleep right now, in their apartment 12 miles south of here, with a neighbor checking in. Inside the conference room, Victoria Hayes stood at the head of the table, reviewing a document she had already read 4 times. She was the CEO of Hayes Capital Group, and tonight's negotiation was the most important deal her company had attempted in a decade. $300 million in cross-border investment, structured across 3 parties, her firm a Japanese industrial group and a private investment house out of the Gulf. If it closed, it would define the next chapter of her career. If it didn't, she would spend the next 2 years explaining why. Victoria was not someone who allowed herself to fail. She had built her company from a 2-person advisory firm into one of the most recognized capital groups in the Midwest, and she had done it by controlling every variable in every room she walked into. Tonight, she had 12 interpreters, on standby specialists in Japanese, Arabic, German, and French, the languages represented by the various documents and parties involved. She had briefed them personally. She had reviewed their credentials. She had left nothing to chance. Kenji Tanaka arrived at 10 minutes before 11. He was the lead representative of Tanaka Industrial, an Osaka-based manufacturing group looking to expand its North American distribution network. He was a compact, composed man in his late 50s, dressed in a dark suit with no tie. He greeted Victoria with a slight bow and a firm handshake, and he said very little after that. He took the seat to her left and placed a leather portfolio on the table in front of him. His 2 assistants sat behind him against the wall and did not speak. Amir al-Rashid arrived 7 minutes later, moving fast. He was broad-shouldered and loud in the way that some wealthy men are loud, not reckless, but certain. He shook hands with Victoria, nodded at Kenji, and dropped into the chair across the table with the ease of a man who treated every room like it already belonged to him. He was the managing director of Al Rashid Ventures, one of the most active private investment groups in the Gulf region, and he had flown in from Dubai that morning. He was not patient by nature, but he was smart enough to know when a deal was worth sitting still for. This, he had decided, was one of those deals. Out in the hallway, Daniel had moved his cart about 15 feet closer to the conference room. He wasn't doing it deliberately. He was simply working his section the way he did every night. But as he wrung out the mop and started on the next stretch of floor, he could hear voices through the closed door. Not words, yet just the rhythm of conversation, the back and forth of people trying to understand each other across a table. He kept his eyes down and kept working. The negotiation began at 11:15. Victoria opened with a summary of the deal's structure, the investment breakdown, the distribution framework, the projected return timeline. One of the Japanese interpreters translated for Kenji. A second interpreter rendered the same content into Arabic for Amir. Both men listened without expression. The first complication arrived within 20 minutes. Victoria referenced a clause in the framework document regarding profit sharing during the first operational phase. The Japanese interpreter translated the clause, but used a phrase that carried a connotation of provisional commitment, something closer to tentative arrangement than the structured agreement that Victoria had intended. Kenji's expression did not change, but he set down his pen. He asked a short question in Japanese. The interpreter answered. Kenji said nothing more, but he did not pick his pen back up. Victoria noticed. She moved on. The Arabic interpreter ran into trouble next. A paragraph about performance benchmarks used industry-specific language that the interpreter rendered accurately in vocabulary, but incorrectly in tone. The phrasing came across as conditional in a way that implied distrust of Al-Rashid Ventures' capacity to deliver. Amir caught it immediately. He leaned forward and asked the interpreter to repeat the passage. The interpreter did. Amir's jaw tightened. "That is not how we do business," he said in English, his accent sharp and deliberate. "We do not need benchmarks that read like we are being supervised." Victoria clarified that the language was standard for this type of agreement and was not directed at any single party. Amir accepted this, but his posture did not relax. The room moved forward, but it moved carefully the way people move when they are beginning to distrust the ground beneath them. Out in the hallway, Daniel had stopped moving. He stood with both hands on the mop handle, his head slightly tilted toward the door. His expression had changed, not in a way anyone would notice if they'd been watching, but it had changed. The interpretations coming through the walls were wrong. Not catastrophically, not yet, but wrong in the way that quiet errors are wrong, precisely and visibly in the places where it would matter most. He recognized the Japanese phrasing the interpreter had used. He knew what it meant, and he knew what had been intended, and those two things were not the same. He recognized the Arabic construction Amir had bristled at. He understood why. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the closed door. Then he picked up his mop and moved his cart to the far end of the hallway, away from the room, and went back to work. By 11:50, the negotiation had deteriorated in the way that slow leaks deteriorate, not suddenly, but steadily in a direction that only gets worse. Kenji had grown quiet. Not politely quiet, but the particular quiet of a man who has decided that speaking further is not worth the effort. He answered questions in short sentences. He stopped offering information that hadn't been asked for. His assistants exchanged a glance behind him that Victoria clocked but couldn't interpret. Amir was the opposite. He was getting louder, more direct, more impatient with the lag between what was said and what was understood. He had asked 3 clarifying questions in the last 10 minutes, and each answer had satisfied him less than the one before. The interpreter assigned to bridge between Kenji and Amir, a specialist in both Japanese and Arabic business communication, attempted a summary of Kenji's most recent position. It was meant to be neutral. It was not. The interpreter rendered a phrase that Kenji had used a formal expression of measured optimism as something closer to reluctant tolerance. In Japanese business language, the phrase was a signal of genuine interest. In the interpreter's Arabic rendering, it sounded like Kenji was present at the table, but not fully committed to anything on it. Amir heard it. His eyes moved to Kenji. "Mr. Tanaka." Amir said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted to be taken seriously. "I want to ask you, directly, do you actually want this deal? Or are you here as a courtesy?" The Japanese interpreter rendered the question. Kenji's expression did not move, but something behind his eyes went cold. He replied in Japanese quietly and precisely 4 sentences. The interpreter translated, "Mr. Tanaka says he has come a long way and has reviewed this proposal carefully. He is here in good faith." It was not what Kenji had said. It was a fraction of what Kenji had said, and the fraction that was left out was the part that would have answered Amir's real question. Amir pushed back from the table and stood up. "I do not make $300 million decisions with men who cannot give me a straight answer," he said. "I don't care how good the numbers are. If there is no trust in this room, there is no deal." Victoria rose to her feet. "Mr. Al-Rashid, I understand your concern, but I want to assure you, I am not concerned," Amir said. "I am done." He reached for the portfolio in front of him. In the hallway, Daniel heard the shift in the room. He couldn't see it, but he heard it, the scrape of a chair, the change in Amir's voice, the way Victoria's words came faster and higher than they had all night. He knew the sound of a room coming apart. He set the mop against the wall. He stood there for 3 full seconds looking at the door. He thought about his son, Noah, asleep right now, 12 miles south of here, with a neighbor checking in. He thought about this job, the only stable thing he'd held on to for 3 years. He thought about what it would mean to walk in there. He thought about what it would mean not to. Then he thought about the look on Kenji's face when that interpreter had gotten it wrong, the slight tightening around the eyes, the way a man looks when he realizes that the words coming out of someone else's mouth are not the words he put in. Daniel had worn that look before. He knew exactly what it felt like. He pushed the door open and walked in. Every head in the room turned. Victoria stared at him. Amir, still half standing, looked him over. Once the gray uniform, the badge, the mop-roughened hands, and his expression settled into something that was not quite dismissal, but was close. Kenji looked at Daniel, the way Kenji looked at everything, without showing what he thought. Daniel did not apologize for entering. He did not explain himself. He looked at Amir and said in a steady voice. The phrase Mr. Tanaka used was not reluctance. In his context, it was the strongest form of professional endorsement he would offer at this stage of a first meeting. You misheard him, not because you weren't listening, but because the translation was wrong. The room was completely still. Amir's hand was still resting on his portfolio. He did not pick it up. Victoria found her voice first. "Who are you?" Her tone was not a question so much as a warning. "I work in this building," Daniel said. "I've been in the hallway for the last hour." "You need to leave," Victoria said. "Right now." "Give me 30 seconds," Daniel said. He did not raise his voice. He turned to Kenji and spoke in Japanese, clean, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who had learned the language not in a classroom, but through years of deliberate immersion. He repeated precisely what Kenji had said, and then he offered the full context of it, the cultural register, the degree of formality, the weight of what the phrase actually carried. When he finished, he looked at Kenji and said quietly, "Did I understand you correctly?" Kenji looked at him for a long moment. Then he gave a single slow nod. "Yes," Kenji said in English, speaking the word carefully, like he was testing whether it would hold. "That is what I meant." Amir had not moved. He was looking at Daniel with an expression that had shifted from something like suspicion into something he hadn't decided on yet. Slowly, he pulled his chair back and sat down. Victoria did not tell Daniel to leave again. She didn't say anything. She stood at the head of the table with her hands flat on the surface and looked at this man in a janitor's uniform who had just done what 12 professional interpreters had failed to do, and she had no category for him. Daniel stood near the door where he had stopped when he came in. He did not move toward the table. He did not take a seat. He simply waited the way a man waits when he knows he has earned the next 30 seconds, but nothing beyond that. Victoria was the first to speak. She looked at Daniel the way she looked at unexpected variables, not with anger, yet but with the particular focus of someone calculating risk in real time. "You speak Japanese," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "And Arabic," Daniel said, "and a few others." The room absorbed that. Amir leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, watching Daniel, the way you watch someone who has just done something you didn't think was possible, and you're still deciding whether to trust it. Kenji had his hands folded on the table. His expression returned to its careful neutrality, but he had not looked away from Daniel since the confirmation. Victoria straightened. "That doesn't explain why you're in this room." "No," Daniel said. "It doesn't." There was a beat of silence. Then Victoria turned to one of the interpreters along the wall, a woman who had been sitting rigid since Daniel walked in, and said, "Is he right about the translation?" The interpreter's mouth opened slightly. Then she nodded, once tight and uncomfortable. "The phrase does carry a stronger positive connotation in formal Japanese business context. I rendered it conservatively." Victoria turned back to Daniel. Her expression had shifted by approximately nothing, but something behind it had changed. "Stay by the door," she said. "Don't sit down. Don't speak unless I ask you to." Daniel nodded and stayed exactly where he was. The negotiation resumed. Victoria moved through the next section of the framework document with the focused efficiency of someone who had lost 40 minutes and intended to recover them. She directed questions through Daniel, now not officially, not with any acknowledgement that this was a change in protocol, but practically. When Kenji spoke at length, she looked at Daniel. When Amir asked something that required cultural context, she waited for Daniel to confirm the interpretation before moving on. It worked, not smoothly. There was still friction, still the occasional moment where Amir's directness collided with Kenji's formality, and someone had to find the middle ground, but it worked in a way the previous hour had not. The conversation began to have weight again. Proposals were made and received. Numbers were discussed. The $300 million structure started to feel for the first time all night like something that might actually exist by morning. Daniel stood near the door and did his job. He did not editorialize. He did not offer opinions. When he translated completely the words, the register, the intent beneath the words. He had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing an interpreter could do was decide what the other person really meant, and then say that instead. People deserved to be heard in their own voice, even when that voice was inconvenient. During a short break, Victoria had called 10 minutes for the parties to review a revised clause. Daniel moved to the far corner of the room and stood with a glass of water he'd been handed by one of Kenji's assistants. He hadn't asked for it. The assistant had simply brought it to him without making eye contact, a small gesture that Daniel recognized as something more deliberate than it appeared. He looked out at the city beyond the windows. 42 floors down, Chicago was doing what Chicago did at midnight, moving lit, indifferent to what was happening in any single room above it. He thought about a classroom. He was 20 years old in this memory, sitting in the third row of a linguistics lecture, and the professor, a compact, energetic woman who had spent 30 years studying language acquisition, was writing a phrase on the board in 4 different scripts simultaneously. She had stopped mid-sentence, turned around, and pointed directly at Daniel. "You," she said, "hear things the rest of them don't. I don't know what to do with you yet, but I know that." He had laughed, embarrassed. He had also known she was right. He had been going to do something with it. That had been the plan. Then, in the spring of his junior year, the woman he'd been with for 2 years left quickly, completely the way people leave when they've already made the decision before they say it out loud. She left behind a 2-year-old boy named Noah and a note that said she wasn't ready. Daniel had read the note once, folded it, and put it in a drawer he never opened again. He withdrew from school the following week. He found work. He found a place to live. He found a way to make it function day by day in the way that single parents find ways to make things function not elegantly, but reliably. The languages stayed. He couldn't have given them up if he'd tried. He read in whatever language he could get his hands on, library books, second-hand tapes, old newspapers in languages he was still learning. It was the one thing that cost nothing and took nothing from Noah. He could do it at night after his son was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp on, and the city quiet outside. It had never felt like discipline. It had always felt like the only part of his life that was entirely his. He came back to the present. Amir was on the phone in the corner, speaking rapidly in Arabic. Kenji was reviewing his portfolio with one of his assistants, murmuring in Japanese. Victoria was standing at the window on the opposite side of the room, with her arms crossed, looking out at the city. Daniel had not looked at the contract document yet. He had been focused on the conversation. But now during the break, one of Victoria's legal team had left a marked copy of the framework on the side table. Daniel glanced at it. Then he looked more carefully. He read the clause on page 14 slowly. He read it again. The original language was dense standard for this type of cross-border investment structure, but the translation had made a specific error. Not a vocabulary error, a structural one. The clause as written in the English version, that both Victoria and Amir were working from, distributed the first phase risk exposure between both parties equally. But the original German construction, the version that had been the source document, allocated the majority of that exposure to the non-American investor. In practice, in the event of a first phase shortfall, Amir's firm would absorb a loss that the English translation had made invisible. It was not a small error. It was the kind of error that cost people money they didn't know they were going to lose. Daniel set the document down carefully. He looked at the room. When the break ended and Victoria called everyone back to the table, Daniel waited until the room had resettled. Then he said, "There's something in the clause on page 14 that needs to be addressed before you go further." Victoria looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between controlled and dangerous. "We're past page 14. "I know," Daniel said. "But the German source document and the English translation don't say the same thing. The risk allocation in the first operational phase is structured differently in each version. Mr. Al-Rashid is working from the English. He should know what the German says." The room went very still. Amir straightened in his chair. He looked at Daniel, then at Victoria. "What does the German say?" he asked, his voice dropping into a register that had no warmth in it at all. Daniel told him. He was precise, and he was brief. He explained the structural difference, the practical implication, and the specific circumstance under which it would matter. He did not editorialize. He did not assign blame. He stated what was there. When he finished, Amir turned to look at Victoria with the expression of a man who has just been told that the floor he is standing on is not as solid as he was led to believe. "Is this true?" he said. Victoria had gone still. She was looking at the document now at page 14, and whatever she found there was telling her that Daniel was right. Daniel could see it in the way she held the page, not with the confidence of someone about to dispute a claim, but with the careful attention of someone reading a thing for the first time, even though she'd seen it before. "This was not intentional," she said. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it was working hard. "This document went through 3 rounds of legal review. If there is an error in the translation, there is," Daniel said. "Then it will be corrected," Victoria said. She looked at Amir. "This is not how I conduct business." "Perhaps not," Amir said. "But it is what is written." He looked at the document in front of him, then set it flat on the table. "I need to understand how this happened, and why no one caught it before tonight." Kenji had not spoken. He was watching the exchange with the focused attention of someone listening to a conversation in a language he partially understands, taking in everything, committing to nothing. Victoria turned to Daniel. Her voice had an edge in it, now that had not been there before. "You're saying this was a translation error, not a deliberate one." "I'm saying the German and the English don't match," Daniel said. "What that means is your call." "You are not a lawyer," Victoria said. You are not a member of this negotiating team. You are not even supposed to be in this room." "No," Daniel agreed. "I'm not." "Then what gives you the right to introduce this into the middle of a negotiation and let it sit there like an accusation?" "He deserves to know what he's signing," Daniel said. He said it quietly, without aggression, without apology. He meant it the way he meant most things, completely, without room for negotiation. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the silences before it. Amir was looking at Daniel. Kenji was looking at Daniel. Victoria was looking at Daniel, and her hands were flat on the table, and she was very, very still. Then Amir said, "I don't know who you are, but you are the only person in this room tonight who has told me something I needed to hear." He looked at Victoria. "I want this clause rewritten before we continue. Tonight, I want the German version and the English version to say the same thing, and I want to see both." Victoria held Amir's gaze for a moment. Then she turned to her legal team member at the back of the room and said, "Pull up the source document." The legal team member moved immediately. The room shifted not back to where it had been, but into a new configuration that nobody had planned for. It took 11 minutes. The legal team member found the source document, pulled the relevant clause, and laid both versions side by side on the table. The discrepancy was exactly what Daniel had described. Victoria looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at Amir and said, "The error is real. I am sorry. My team missed it, and that is my responsibility." Amir nodded once, slowly. He looked like a man deciding something, though it was not yet clear what. Then Kenji spoke. He spoke in Japanese, 3 quiet sentences, and he looked at Daniel when he said them. Daniel translated without being asked. "Mr. Tanaka says that an honest correction is worth more than a smooth negotiation. He says this is a better room than it was an hour ago." Amir looked at Kenji. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one man for another who has just said something he agrees with. Victoria sat down for the first time all night. The revised clause was drafted in 30 minutes. Both versions were placed in front of Amir. He read them carefully, asked 2 questions that Daniel translated, received answers that satisfied him, and nodded. The room returned to the framework document. Page 15. The negotiation moved forward, and then Amir, reading ahead, stopped at a section near the back of the document. He read it twice. He looked up at Daniel and said in Arabic, "This section, does this mean what I think it means?" Daniel read it. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did a slight settling, the kind that happens when a person realizes they are standing at the edge of something they didn't see coming. The clause was about arbitration jurisdiction. In the event of a dispute, the document designated a specific legal framework that in practice heavily favored the American party. Daniel read it carefully a second time to be certain. The language was constructed to sound neutral, balanced phrasing, symmetrical structure on the surface, but the designated jurisdiction and the procedural rules it invoked were ones that any non-American party would navigate at a significant disadvantage. It was not a translation error. It was language that had been written that way, and either no one had noticed or the document had passed through review without anyone stopping to consider how it read from the other side of the table. Daniel looked at the clause. He looked at Amir. He looked at Victoria. He had a choice to make, and he had about 4 seconds to make it. "Yes," he said to Amir in Arabic. "It means what you think it means." The room detonated. Amir was on his feet before Daniel finished the sentence. "This is not a negotiation," he said loud. Now the measured control gone entirely. This is a document designed to protect one party at the expense of another. I don't care how much money is on this table. I will not be managed. He looked at Victoria with something that had moved past suspicion into something harder. "Did you think I wouldn't see this?" Victoria was standing too. "Mr. Al-Rashid, The arbitration clause is standard for agreements of this. It is not standard for me, Amir said. And you knew that. I did not structure this document to disadvantage you. Then why does it? Amir's voice was flat and final. He picked up his portfolio. We're done. Victoria turned to Daniel, and her voice dropped to something that was barely controlled. You just told him to read it that way. I told him what it said, Daniel said. You are a janitor, Victoria said. You walked into my negotiation without permission, introduced 2 separate disruptions, and now you have just cost me $300 million. Her voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow worse than if she had raised it. Get out of this room. Right now. If you are still in this building in 10 minutes, I will call security myself. Daniel looked at her. He did not argue. He did not explain himself again. He walked to the door and opened it and stepped out into the hallway. The door closed behind him with a sound that was very final. The hallway was exactly as he had left it. The mop cart sat where he'd parked it against the wall, the bucket still half full, the water gone cold. The overhead lights ran the length of the corridor in a long, unbroken line, and under them everything looked the same as it had an hour ago. The marble floor, the closed doors, the city visible at the far end through a narrow window. Daniel sat down on the floor with his back against the wall a few feet from the cart. He was not a man who sat on floors, but his legs had made the decision before he did, and he let them. He could still hear voices inside the conference room, not words, just the shape of an argument, the specific sound of people talking past each other when the thing they're arguing about is no longer really the point. He knew that sound. He had been in enough rooms to know that once a negotiation reached that register, it rarely came back on its own. He took his phone out of his pocket. The screen showed one unread message sent at 11:47. It was from his son, Noah. The message said, Dad, I got a 10 on my spelling test. The whole thing. Mrs. Patterson said I was the only one. I'm leaving the light on so you can see it when you get home. Daniel read the message twice. Then he turned the screen off and held the phone in both hands and looked at the floor in front of him. Noah was 8 years old, and he still left the light on. Daniel had told him once, 2 years ago, maybe 3, that he liked coming home to a lit window. He hadn't said it as a lesson or a habit. He'd said it because it was true offhandedly the way you say things to a child when you're not thinking about what they'll do with it. Noah had been leaving the light on ever since. Daniel thought about that. He thought about 12 miles south of here, a small apartment on the 3rd floor, a lamp in the window, a kid asleep with his shoes still on because he'd been waiting and lost the fight against sleep. He thought about what it would mean to go home tonight without a job. He thought about what it would mean to go home knowing he'd walked away from the only moment in 3 years when something he was had actually mattered. Inside the conference room, someone's voice rose sharply. Then it stopped. Daniel stood up. He knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for an answer. The room was worse than he'd left it. Amir was standing near the window with his back to the table, his portfolio under his arm, his phone in his hand. Kenji was still seated, but his assistants had risen and were quietly consolidating documents. Victoria was at the head of the table, both hands flat on the surface, staring at nothing with the expression of someone who has not yet accepted what is happening. The interpreters along the wall had gone very still. Victoria looked up when Daniel came in. I told you to leave the building. I know, Daniel said. I need 5 minutes. After that, I'll go and I won't ask for anything. You don't have 5 minutes to give, Victoria said. This meeting is over. Amir turned from the window. He looked at Daniel with an expression that hadn't softened, but it had shifted. There was something in it now that was closer to attention than anger. He did not tell Daniel to leave. Daniel looked at all 3 of them. He did not move toward the table. He stayed near the door, the same position he'd held all night, and he spoke clearly and without rushing. I want to say something to each of you, he said. Not as a translator, just as someone who's been in this room for the last 2 hours. Nobody told him to stop. He took that as permission. He turned to Kenji first, and he spoke in Japanese. He said, "What Mr. Al-Rashid wants from this agreement is not control. He wants to know that if something goes wrong, he will not be standing alone. That is not a demand. That is the same thing you want. You have been saying it differently all night, but you have been saying the same thing." Kenji's hands folded on the table in front of him, did not move. But he was listening in the way that still people listen completely. Then Daniel turned to Amir and spoke in Arabic. He said, "The arbitration clause, it was not placed there to trap you. I've read this type of document before. The structure came from a standard template that was drafted without accounting for how it reads from a non-American position. It is a serious problem, but it is not the same as intention. Victoria did not sit down tonight planning to take advantage of you. What she did was inherit a document that no one on her team read carefully enough from your side of the table. That is different from deception, and you know the difference." Amir's jaw was set. He did not respond immediately, but he had not moved toward the door. Daniel turned to Victoria last, and he spoke in English, because English was all he needed. "Mr. Tanaka is not being difficult. He has been trying to tell you all night that he is willing, genuinely willing, but in his professional context, willingness is expressed through restraint, not enthusiasm. Every time the room got loud, he went quiet. That's not reluctance. That's respect for the weight of what's being decided. He came a long way to sit at this table. He would not have come if he didn't intend to sign." Victoria looked at him. Her expression was unreadable in the way that very controlled people become unreadable when something has gotten through. The room held still. It was Kenji who moved first. He unfolded his hands, placed them flat on the table, and looked across at Amir. Then he spoke in English carefully, with the deliberate pace of a man choosing each word from a language that is not his first, but choosing well. "I did not come here to be protected," Kenji said. "I came here to build something. If we cannot agree on the terms tonight, I am willing to return. But I would prefer not to return." He looked at Amir directly, which was not something he had done all evening. "I would prefer to finish this." The room absorbed that. Amir looked at Kenji for a long moment. Something in his posture changed, not a collapse, not a concession, but a settling. The difference between a man who is braced for a fight and a man who has decided the fight is no longer necessary. He set his portfolio down on the side table. He did not open it. He just set it down. "The arbitration clause," Amir said, looking at Victoria. "It gets rewritten. Equal jurisdiction. Both parties have the same standing in any dispute. That is not negotiable." "Agreed," Victoria said. She said it without hesitation, without qualification. She said it the way people say things when they have already decided and are simply waiting for the right moment to say them out loud. Amir nodded once. He pulled out the chair in front of him and sat back down at the table. Kenji's assistants, without being asked, began returning the documents they had started to collect. One of them placed the revised framework back at the center of the table. Kenji straightened it with 2 fingers and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up. "We continue," he said. It took another 40 minutes. The arbitration clause was rewritten by Victoria's legal team member on a laptop at the side of the room, both versions checked, line by line, with Daniel's confirmation before either Kenji or Amir would accept them. 2 other sections were revisited at Amir's request. Each time Daniel translated not just the language, but the intent, the register, the thing beneath the words that the words were trying to carry. At 2:17 in the morning, Amir al-Rashid signed the framework agreement. Kenji Tanaka signed it 4 minutes later, after reading the final page one more time in the unhurried way he read everything. Victoria Hayes signed last. She used the same pen she had brought to the table at 11 o'clock, the one she'd set down when Amir first stood up to leave. The room was quiet when it was done. Not the tense quiet of earlier in the night, but the specific quiet of people who have finished something difficult. and are still adjusting to the fact that it's finished. Amir stood, and for the first time all night he smiled. It was a real smile. Brief, unguarded, the kind that appears when a person is not thinking about how they look. He looked at Daniel and said in Arabic, "You should have been in this room from the beginning." Daniel translated it because Victoria was watching, and because it deserved to be understood. Victoria escorted Kenji and Amir to the elevator. Daniel could hear the conversation in the corridor, professional, warm, in the way that conversations become warm after something hard has been successfully completed. When the elevator doors closed and the floor went quiet, Victoria came back into the conference room. Daniel was standing near the door, his badge in his hand, turning it over slowly. Victoria crossed the room and stood a few feet from him. She looked tired, not defeated, but the specific tiredness of someone who has spent everything they had on a single night and come out the other side. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and took out a business card. She set it on the cart he had wheeled in from the hallway, the one still sitting just inside the door where he'd left it. "Language consultant," she said. "Senior level. The position has been open for 8 months. I haven't filled it because no one I interviewed understood the difference between translating words and translating people." She looked at him steadily. "You do?" Daniel picked up the card. He looked at it for a moment. The clean sans serif font, the Hayes Capital Group logo, Victoria's direct line printed beneath her name. He put it in his shirt pocket. "Thank you," he said. Victoria nodded once. Then she turned back to the table and began collecting her documents, and Daniel picked up the handle of his cart and wheeled it toward the door. The elevator down was empty and slow. Daniel stood in it, with his cart and his mop and his badge clipped back to his pocket and the business card resting against his chest, watching the floor numbers count down from 42. The city appeared in the lobby windows as the elevator descended. First the upper skyline, then the mid-rise buildings, then the street level lit and moving even at this hour. He walked out through the lobby, nodded to the overnight security guard, and pushed through the glass doors into the cold Chicago air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up 42 floors, the conference room window still lit from inside, the only bright point in that section of the building's face. He took his phone out and opened Noah's message. He read it one more time. "I'm leaving the light on so you can see it when you get home." Daniel typed back, "I'm on my way. Good work on the spelling test." He put the phone in his pocket and started walking toward the parking structure. The city moved around him the way it always did, without noticing, without adjusting, without caring who he was or what he had just done. That was fine. He had never needed the city to notice. He thought about Noah asleep with the lamp on. He thought about the card in his pocket. He thought about a classroom a long time ago, and a professor who had told him he heard things other people didn't. And what he thought was, she was right. And it still counted even here, even now, even like this. He walked. The city held the night around him. Somewhere ahead, 12 miles south, a window was lit.